blizzard had been screaming for 3 days when the knock came. Merritt Whitmore was sitting at the edge of the trapdoor with a tin cup of coffee going cold in her hands, listening to the wind tear at the roof of the cabin above her like something alive that wanted in. The oil lantern hanging from the cedar beam swayed in the draft that slipped down the ladder. Her dog, a thick-coated shepherd named Keeper, lifted his head from the woolen blanket beside the little iron stove and pointed his ears toward the ceiling. She heard it then, 3 slow thuds on the cabin door above, not the wind, a fist. Merritt set the cup down carefully on the stone shelf beside her. She climbed the ladder without hurrying, because hurrying in a blizzard was how you made mistakes that killed you. And she had not survived this far by making mistakes. The cabin above the cellar was dark except for the orange glow from the main stove. The windows were blind with frost. The thermometer on the wall read 4 degrees below zero, and that was inside. She lifted the heavy oak bar and pulled the door open against the force of the drift piled against it. A wall of snow tumbled inward at her boots. Beyond the threshold, half swallowed by the white, a figure hung on its knees with one gloved hand still raised, as though it had not yet realized the door had opened. The coat was expensive wool, now stiff with ice. The hat was gone. The face lifted slowly to hers, eyelashes rimed with frost lips blue as bruised plums, and Merritt saw the face she had sworn she would never let inside her house. For one long heartbeat, she stood in the open doorway with the storm roaring past her shoulders, and the man who had tried to take everything from her, freezing to death at her feet. The choice that stood in front of her in that howling doorway was the choice her mother had spent 5 quiet years preparing her to make, though neither of them had ever spoken the words aloud. She reached down and caught him under the arms. 3 months before, that night in the sticky heat of a Michigan August, Adeline Whitmore died in her sleep in the back room of the small frame house just outside Traverse City, where she had raised 3 daughters, mostly alone. It was the 4th of August in the year 1886. She was 51 years old. She had worked as a seamstress and a laundress and a midwife for families who could pay in cash and families who could only pay in eggs or cordwood, and she had never in her life raised her voice at anyone who did not deserve it. Her youngest daughter arrived too late. Merritt had been sweeping the floor of Horst Meltzer's general store on Front Street when the boy came with the message. She walked home with the apron still tied around her waist and the broom dust still on her sleeves, because the message had said only that her mother was gone, and she did not understand that it meant gone forever, until she saw the door of the house standing open and her sisters already inside with paper and pencil. Harriet was at the kitchen table. She was 31 years old, and she held herself the way a courthouse clerk holds a ledger, upright and a little tilted back, as though to keep distance between herself and any information she had not yet approved. Her hair was pinned so tight it pulled her brows up. Her mourning dress had been bought, not borrowed, and Merritt had a brief, uncharitable thought about when exactly Harriet had found time to buy it. Cordelia sat beside her. At 27, she was softer than Harriet in every way a person could be. Softer. Softer voice, softer cheeks, softer spine. Her 2 small children, a girl of 5 and a boy of 3, were playing with wooden spoons on the braided rug by the stove. Cordelia looked up when Merritt came in, and her eyes were red, but she did not stand. "There you are," Harriet said. Her tone was the tone of a woman speaking to a servant who had been sent out for a spool of thread and returned with the wrong color. "We've been waiting." Merritt untied the apron slowly. She folded it and laid it across the back of a chair. She walked to the back room where her mother lay, and she knelt beside the bed and put her hand on Adeline's cold hand, and she stayed there long enough that she heard Harriet sigh from the kitchen and say something to Cordelia that she could not quite catch. When Merritt came back out, her eyes were dry. She had learned at an early age that tears in front of Harriet were a coin her sister liked to collect. "We should get this done before Reverend Asher arrives," Harriet said. She tapped the pencil against the paper. "I've been through the house. I've made a list." Merritt said nothing. She sat down at the far end of the table where the light from the window fell on the wood grain, and she waited. The list, when Harriet read it, was exactly the list Merritt had expected. The frame house in town, with its 2 bedrooms and its proper iron stove and its glass windows, went to Harriet. The 40 acres of cleared river-bottom land that their father had broken with a mule and a cedar plow before his death. The land that grew oats and potatoes and kept the family fed through Merritt's entire childhood went to Cordelia. The savings in the tin box above the mantel, $32 and some coins, were to be split between the 2 elder daughters to cover funeral costs and what Harriet called immediate obligations. For Merritt, there was the stone cabin. Harriet pushed a folded paper across the table. Her expression had arranged itself into the particular arrangement she used when she wanted to appear gracious. Her eyes did not match the expression. "Mother wanted you to have the cabin on the ridge," Harriet said. "The deed is in order. I checked." Cordelia would not look at her. Merritt unfolded the paper slowly. It was her mother's handwriting. The cabin on Bluestone Ridge, 4 miles north on the old logging track. The 1-room fieldstone structure with the leaking cedar roof and the collapsed chimney, and no well for a 1/4 mile in any direction. The piece of land so rocky that when their father had looked at it 30 years earlier, he had laughed and said you could farm it if you were partial to eating gravel. The lot that their mother had disappeared to sometimes for whole weekends through the past 5 years of her life, always returning quiet and tired and carrying nothing visible. "I'm sorry, Merritt," Harriet said in a voice that was not sorry at all. "Mother always had her strange attachments. I think she thought you'd appreciate the solitude." "She could sell the stones," Cordelia offered, looking at her hands. "For foundations. Mr. Yarrow in town pays for good fieldstone. Or she could live there." Harriet's mouth moved into something that was almost a smile. "If she wanted to freeze to death by Christmas." Merritt folded the paper again. She ran her thumb along the crease. She could feel her mother's hand in the paper, the weight of the ink, the careful and unhurried letters. She thought of her mother sitting at this table drafting this very deed in the months before her death. And she thought of all the weekends her mother had vanished up that logging track. And she thought very clearly and for the first time that perhaps her mother had not been strange at all. Perhaps her mother had been the only one in this family who had ever seen anything clearly. She put the paper in the pocket of her skirt. "Thank you," she said. It was the only thing she said in that kitchen for the rest of the afternoon. She walked back to the store at dusk and asked Horst Meltzer if she could borrow his mule and cart the next morning. Horst was a broad, slow-moving German who had come up from Milwaukee 20 years earlier and had liked her mother in a quiet way he never quite put into words. He said yes without asking what for. That night, Merritt sat up at the kitchen table in the house that was no longer hers, and she read her mother's deed 3 times by lamplight. And she noticed on the 3rd reading that at the very bottom of the page, her mother had written a single line in a smaller hand as if it were an afterthought. "The warm air rises through the floor. Follow it." She read that line until her eyes burned and she did not understand it, and she slept on it anyway. The morning of the 5th of August came up gold and blue over Grand Traverse Bay. By 6 o'clock, Merritt was on the logging track behind Horst's mule with an axe and a canvas bag of biscuits and a lantern and her mother's deed folded in her pocket. The track climbed north through second-growth birch and stands of cedar so dense the light came down green. The road had not been used by wagons in years, and in places the mule had to pick through stone and root, and Merritt had to get down and lead him. Deer flies circled her face. A pair of ravens followed overhead for a while, calling back and forth in voices that sounded like old men having an argument. She had not been up this track since she was 12. After 4 miles, the track topped a granite ridge and the trees broke, and there was the cabin. It was exactly as bad as she remembered and somehow worse. The walls were thick fieldstone laid with the kind of patient craftsmanship that had gone out of fashion 20 years ago. But the mortar between the upper courses had crumbled, and whole sections looked as if a hard wind might take them. The roof was cedar shake gone black with mold, and a good third of the shakes had peeled off in the last bad winter. The plank door hung askew on a single leather hinge. The chimney was not collapsed exactly, but it leaned, and a crow had built a nest in the top of it. No glass in the single window. Only an oilskin sheet tacked across rotted, now flapping. Around the cabin, the lot was 10 acres of broken granite ledge and birch scrub, and the occasional patch of wild raspberry clawing up between the stones. No water, no cleared ground, no fence. The nearest neighbor, old Alden Brennan on his wooded quarter section, was 3 miles south through timber. Merritt stood in the open ground in front of the door and felt the deed in her pocket and did not cry. She tied the mule to a birch, and she walked slowly around the whole perimeter of the building, and she looked at every stone. And when she had finished her circle, she stopped and stood very still, because her mother had built this. Her mother had not built it new. It had been a trapper's shelter once her father had told her 40 years before, but her mother had kept it for 5 years, kept it for something. She ducked through the leaning doorway into the dim of the single room. Inside, the air smelled of damp earth and old cedar and the faint sweetness of dried apples that was not quite gone. The floor was rough plank laid directly onto the ground, and many of the boards had warped and lifted at the ends. An iron stove sat in the corner with its pipe disconnected and lying on its side on the floor. A wooden table, small, held together with wedges, a 3-legged stool, a crate that had once held tallow candles empty, now lined with newsprint from a Detroit paper dated 1879. She stood in the center of that room with the ruined stove in front of her and the tilted door behind her, and she listened to her own breathing. And then she felt it. The air at her ankles was not the dampness of bare dirt under the planks. It was moving. It was moving upward, steady and slow, through the gaps between the boards. And it was not cold. Merritt knelt. She put her palm flat to the widest gap between 2 warped planks, and she closed her eyes. The air coming up through her fingers was the temperature of a root cellar in April, even and mild and faintly humid. It should have been the damp chill of Michigan bedrock in the shadow of a stone wall, and it was not. She sat back on her heels, and she said very quietly in the voice of a daughter who has just been given a gift she does not yet understand, "Mama." She worked the first plank up with the claw of her hatchet. It came hard because her mother had pinned it with a cut nail on purpose, and the nail fought her for a long minute. When the board lifted, she smelled the air of the space beneath, and she knew before her eyes adjusted that it was not bare ground beneath her. She pulled up a second board, a third, a fourth. The light from the open door fell through the gap she had made, and Merritt Whitmore looked down into the dark and saw stone. Not dirt, not the stamped earth of a crawl space. Dressed fieldstone laid in careful courses, forming the wall of a chamber that went down farther than the light could reach. She reached into the gap, and her hand found the top of a wooden ladder, smooth with use, wedged into a bracket her mother had bolted to a crossbeam. Merritt climbed down. 8 feet. She counted the rungs. 8 full feet below the floor of the cabin, she set her boot onto a surface of flat-fitted stone, and she stood up straight in a chamber as wide as the cabin above and half again as long. She held the lantern high with a hand that was not quite steady. The walls were fieldstone laid in lime mortar, dry, immaculate, as well built as any root cellar in the county. The ceiling was supported by oak beams her mother had somehow worked into place alone. At the far end against the north wall stood plank shelves that ran from floor to ceiling, and on those shelves, row upon row, caught the lantern light in 1,000 small curves of glass. Mason jars, sealed with wax and stamped lids, dozens of them. She walked to the shelves and she lifted the nearest jar and she held it to the flame. Green beans canned in clear brine suspended in the glass like a held breath. The next jar was tomatoes. The one beside it was apple butter the color of mahogany, pickled beets, sauerkraut, blackberry preserves dark as wine, strawberry jam, corn relish, smoked trout in oil, dilled cucumbers, stewed pumpkin, peach halves in syrup. She counted as she walked down the length of the shelf, and when she stopped counting, she was at 43 jars, and each one was labeled in her mother's small patient hand with the contents and the date, and the earliest date on any label was the 12th of June, 1881. 5 years. Merritt sat down on the stone floor of her mother's cellar with the lantern beside her, and she put her face into her hands. And then after a moment she laughed once, a broken, astonished laugh, and she wiped her face on her sleeve and she kept looking. Against the east wall, 3 wooden barrels with sealed lids. She pried the first lid up. Wheat dry and clean, hulled and ready for the mill, enough to feed one person through a winter and half a spring. The second barrel held oats. The third held dried beans, 2 varieties layered. On a lower shelf, folded with the exactness of a draper's window, 4 heavy wool blankets and 2 tanned sheepskins with the wool still on. Beside them, a wooden chest that, when she opened it, held a handsaw with a new filed edge, a draw knife, a brace, and bit a box of iron nails already counted into pound weights, a ball of hemp twine, a sharpening stone wrapped in oilcloth, a tin of lamp oil, 4 glass chimneys for lanterns, and a leather pouch of flint and steel. The tools were not old. Most of them had been bought within the last 2 years. Everything a person would need, Merritt thought. Everything a person would need to fix a shelter and live through a Michigan winter alone. She walked the perimeter of the cellar slowly, one hand trailing along the cool stone of the wall, the lantern raised. And at the far southeast corner, where the foundation courses of her mother's masonry met the raw granite of the ridge the cabin stood on, she found the source of it, a seam in the bedrock. A hairline crack no wider than her little finger running down the face of the granite. Water seeped from it slow enough to barely bead. It pooled in a shallow basin worn into the stone by patience older than any human measure, and then trickled away through a second lower crack into the earth. Merritt put her fingers under the trickle, and the water was warm. Not hot, not cold, warm the way skin is warm. She held her palm there for a long time, and she felt the heat soaking through the stone of the basin, up through the lower courses of the walls, radiating outward through the whole chamber. She understood then what her mother had found, and what her mother had done with it. It was a geothermal seep, the kind of quiet, unspectacular feature the land concealed in its bones. Her mother had not built this cellar and this cabin at random. She had built it because of this seam in the rock, and she had worked for 5 years to wrap a chamber of stone around a trickle of warm water on a rocky lot that nobody else had ever looked at twice. Merritt sat on the floor with her back against the warm wall, and she let herself cry, and this time she cried with her shoulders shaking the way she had not allowed herself to cry at the funeral, or at the will reading, or in front of Harriet. When she had emptied herself, she wiped her face on her sleeve, and she looked up, and she saw on the highest shelf, tucked behind a jar of preserved pears, a box she had not noticed before. It was oak, dark with age and with a coat of wax, 4 iron clasps, all of them locked. Across the lid, burned in with a heated iron in her mother's handwriting, were the words, "For my quiet daughter." open when the wind howls. Merritt lifted the box down. It was heavier than she expected. Something inside it shifted paper on paper with the whisper of folded letters. She turned it over in her hands 3 times, and she did not force the clasps. She did not know yet what her mother had meant by the wind howling. She did not know on that warm, bright August afternoon that she would one day. She carried the box up the ladder and she set it on the plank table in the cabin above, and she stood looking at it until the light through the doorway had changed from gold to amber, and she knew she had to ride back to town or be caught in the woods after dark. She went home that evening with the deed in her pocket and the oak box under her arm, and she said nothing to her sisters, and she did not sleep until nearly dawn. The old man came on the 3rd morning. Merritt had been back at the cabin for 2 days straight by then, sleeping the first night on the cellar floor wrapped in one of her mother's wool blankets, and the second night on the plank table above because she was trying to get a sense of the whole building before she started deciding what to fix. Horst Meltzer had given her a week's leave from the store without asking questions. She thought later that he had probably understood more than he said. She was up on the roof at 10 in the morning, balanced on the ridgepole with a hatchet prying off the worst of the rotted cedar shakes when she heard hoofbeats coming up the track. She sat back on the ridgepole and shaded her eyes. The man who came out of the trees was in his 60s, broad-shouldered, still walking beside a chestnut mare loaded with a roll of fresh split cedar shingles. His beard was white and clipped. He wore a heavy wool coat over a worn linen shirt, and the kind of boots a man wears when he has been walking in woods for 40 years. He stopped his mare at the edge of the clearing, pushed his hat back on his head, and looked up at Merritt on the roof without surprise. "You're Adeline's youngest," he said. "I am. Alden Brennan. I live 3 miles down the ridge." "I know who you are, Mr. Brennan. My mother spoke of you." "Did she?" He said it flat, not as a question. She came down the ladder. He tied the mare, and he brought the roll of shingles over and set it on the ground by the door. And he stood for a moment looking at the cabin, and she stood beside him, and neither of them spoke. "Your mother," Alden Brennan said finally, "was the smartest person in any room she ever walked into. And nobody in this county, including me, ever gave her credit for it." "No," Merritt said. "They didn't." He turned his head slightly and looked at her. His eyes were pale blue and very tired. "What have you found?" She understood the question. She did not pretend to misunderstand it. "A cellar," she said, "beneath the floor. She built it around a warm spring in the rock." Alden Brennan closed his eyes, and he let out a breath that had the shape of a laugh in it, though he did not smile. 5 years, he said. "I wondered what she was doing up here on Saturdays. I asked her once. She told me she was resting. She was building. She was building." He opened his eyes. He looked at the shingles at his feet. "I brought these because I saw the smoke from your chimney yesterday, and I figured you'd need them," he said. "Your mother did me a kindness once, a long time ago. I have never been able to repay it. I would like if you will permit me to help you put a roof on this building before the first snow." "Mr. Brennan," Merritt said, "what was the kindness?" He was quiet for a long moment. He watched a raven cross the treetops. "In the winter of '72, he said, I buried my wife and both of my boys in a week. Diphtheria came through the ridge, and it took them, and it should have taken me as well. I didn't want to be alive. I did not want to be alive for a long time. Your mother came up this track in February of that year alone on foot in snow to her knees, and she stayed with me for 9 days. She cooked, she washed, she did not say much. When she left, I was still not happy, but I was alive and I was going to stay alive. She never asked me for anything. She never mentioned it again. For 14 years, I have waited for the chance to do something she would have approved of." He looked at her. Letting me fix this roof, he said, would be a kindness to me. Merritt turned her face away and she looked at the tree line, and she blinked twice slowly, and then she turned back. Thank you, Mr. Brennan. Alden. They worked together through the rest of that day and the next and the next. He was patient and methodical, and he did not speak unless he had something to say. And by the end of the third day, the south face of the roof was shingled tight, and Merritt had learned how to split a cedar shake in one clean blow. On the fourth evening, after he had left for home, she sat alone in the cellar by lantern light, and she pried up the loose stone her mother had marked with a small chipped X on the wall behind the preserved pears. Behind that stone, in a dry recess, her mother had lined with oilcloth, there was a flat leather satchel. Inside the satchel, tied with butcher's twine, was a stack of papers so thick she had to use both hands to lift it. Letters. 47 of them she counted later, each one folded, numbered in her mother's hand and dated. The earliest was dated the 14th of June, 1881. The latest was dated the 15th of July, 1886, 3 weeks before Adeline's death. Merritt untied the twine with her hands shaking. The first letter was short. My quiet daughter, it read, if you are reading this, it means you have found what I built, which means you have noticed what nobody else in this family has ever noticed about you, which is that you pay attention. You pay attention to what the rest of them talk over. You pay attention to the warm air from the floor. You will need that. There are things you do not know about me. There are things I did not tell you because telling you would have put you in danger, and I have spent my life trying to keep you out of danger. I'm going to tell you now, letter by letter, because I do not know how long I have, and because there is a man in Detroit who may one day come looking. Read them in order. Do not skip ahead. There is a reason for the order. I love you, your mother. Merritt read the letter 3 times. Then she folded it with great care and laid it on the stone shelf, and she sat on the ladder for a long time in the warm lantern light. And she said in the voice of someone speaking to a person who was not in the room, I'm listening, Mama. She read the next 3 letters that night. In the first, her mother wrote that she had not been born Adeline Whitmore. She had been born Adeline Prescott in a house on Jefferson Avenue in Detroit in the year 1835, the only child of a lumber broker who had died when she was 15, and a mother who had remarried a man Adeline would not describe. In the second, her mother wrote that at 17 she had met a young man at a church dance. He was the son of a rising timber merchant. He had been charming, and he had been handsome, and he had been... Adeline wrote the first person who ever looked at me as though I were a door he intended to walk through. She had believed him when he told her he would marry her. She had been young enough to believe things. In the third letter, Adeline wrote that when she found herself with child at 18, the young man told her he was already engaged to a daughter of another timber family, that the engagement had been arranged for months, that he regretted the misunderstanding. He offered her a bank draft. Adeline wrote, I took the draft, I cashed it, I did not keep a penny. I bought a wagon and a mule, and I left Detroit in April of 1861 alone, 5 months along, and I came north. She had come to Leelanau County because her aunt on her mother's side, a widow named Edith Halloran, had once owned land up here. When Adeline arrived, Edith was dying. Edith signed the 10 acres of ridge land over to Adeline on her deathbed, and 3 weeks later Edith was in the ground and Adeline was alone in the trapper's cabin on Bluestone Ridge with the first frost coming in. You were born? Adeline wrote at the end of the third letter in this cabin, in December of 1863. I delivered you myself because there was no one. I didn't name you for another 3 days because I was too tired to think. When I named you, I called you Merritt because the old English word meant deserving. And I wanted you to know from the first breath that you deserved every good thing the world could offer. Everything I have done since that night I have done so that you would have what you deserve." Merritt sat in the warm cellar with that letter on her lap, and she wept without sound. She did not read the fourth letter that night. She could not. The first wagon came up the track a week after Alden finished the roof. Merritt was in the yard splitting stove wood when she heard the wheels, and she looked up, and the wagon that came out of the trees was a polished black buckboard with red-spoked wheels and two matched bays, the kind of rig a man drove when he wanted the whole county to know he could afford it. The man on the seat was heavy-set, clean-shaven, perhaps 50. His coat was charcoal broadcloth. His hat was new. He wore a gold watch chain across his vest that caught the sun. He pulled the bays up at the edge of the clearing, and he took off the hat, and he looked around the property with the slow, assessing look of a man pricing cattle. "Good afternoon, Miss Whitmore," he said. His voice was warm. His eyes were not. "I hope I'm not intruding. You have me at a disadvantage, sir." "Cyrus Thorne." He set the hat on the seat beside him. "Thorne Timber and Land. I have offices in Traverse City and Manistee. I do not often drive this far out of town, but I make exceptions for unusual circumstances, and your situation is unusual." "My situation? Your inheritance." He smiled. The smile did not travel past his mouth. "Allow me to offer my sincere condolences on your mother's passing. Adeline was a woman I respected from a distance." The hairs on the back of Merritt's neck stood up. She didn't know why not yet. She set the axe against the chopping block. "You knew my mother, Mr. Thorne, only by reputation. I hear things. In my line of business, I hear things." He folded his gloved hands together. "I will not waste your afternoon. You have come into possession of a 10-acre lot on Bluestone Ridge. The lot is, forgive me, agriculturally worthless. No water, no tillable soil, no timber worth the haul. I would not insult you by pretending otherwise. However, I happen to be consolidating holdings in this section of the county for purposes I won't bore you with. Survey work, long-term speculation. I can offer you $240 cash today for the deed as it stands." $240 was, Merritt calculated without moving her face, about 8 months of her wages at the store. "No," she said. Cyrus Thorne's smile did not falter. His eyes did. Something behind them tightened briefly and then relaxed, and he picked up his hat. "I thought you might say that today," he said. "I hope you will think about it. The winters here are extremely hard on unprepared women. Your mother did not prepare you for much, I understand. You will change your mind before Christmas. When you do, I will still be available. Good afternoon, Miss Whitmore." He turned the buckboard in the yard with practiced ease, and he drove back down the track, and Merritt stood in the cold shadow of the cabin with her heart beating in her throat. And she did not know why a land offer from a stranger had frightened her. But it had. And she did not think it was coincidence that he had come. That night she walked the 3 miles down the ridge to Alden Brennan's place, and she asked him what he knew about Cyrus Thorne, and Alden set down the horseshoe he was repairing, and he looked at her for a long moment before he answered. "Cyrus Thorne," he said, "buys land from widows and from daughters. He has bought out 9 families on this peninsula in the last 4 years. He offers fair prices at first. When he does not get what he wants, he offers other things. Do not sign anything he puts in front of you. Do not go to his office alone." "He came here because my mother died." "Yes." "He came because of the cabin." Alden Brennan was quiet for a long time. "I do not know what is on that ridge that Cyrus Thorne wants," he said, "but I know that he wants it. And I know that your mother knew it too, because she told me 2 summers ago that if anything ever happened to her, I was to make sure you did not take a single dollar from a man named Thorne. She made me promise. I did not understand why. I do now." Merritt rode back to town in the morning. She had not planned to go into Traverse City. She had planned to go to the general store, collect her final week's wages from Horst, and ride back up to the cabin. But as she came down Front Street past the bank, she saw the black buckboard with the red-spoked wheels tied at the hitching post outside a brick building with a brass plate that read Thorn Timber and Land. And she saw her sister Harriet coming out of the door. Harriet was in her best dark dress. Her gloves were new. She was putting a folded paper into a reticule, and she was smiling the private, self-satisfied smile she wore when she believed nobody was looking. She saw Merritt across the street, and her face fell and rose and settled into the expression of a woman who has been caught at something and has already decided to lie about it. "Merritt," Harriet said. She came across the street with the smile reattached. "I did not expect to see you in town." "What were you doing in Mr. Thorne's office, Harriet?" "Nothing. I was inquiring about a piece of land Cordelia's husband had asked me to look into." "Cordelia's husband has been dead for 2 years, Harriet." Harriet's mouth worked. Nothing came out. "What did you sign?" "I did not sign anything." "You put paper in your bag." "It was a receipt, Merritt. For heaven's sake, stop making a scene." Harriet walked past her very quickly toward the frame house at the end of the street. Merritt did not follow. She stood on the plank sidewalk in front of Thorn Timber and Land, and she looked at the brass plate, and she felt her mother's letters in her coat pocket against her ribs, and she understood with a slow and terrible clarity that something was already in motion that she didn't yet see the shape of. She crossed Front Street to the office of Ambrose Crane, attorney at law. Ambrose Crane was in his 50s, thin, bespectacled, a man who had practiced in Leelanau County for 22 years, and who her mother had once told her in passing was the only lawyer in town worth the fee he charged. His door was open. His office smelled of pipe smoke and old paper. He looked up when she came in. He stood slowly as if he'd been expecting her for some time and was only now being given permission to acknowledge it. "Miss Whitmore," he said. "I wondered when you might come." She sat down across from him. She laid her mother's deed on his desk. "Mr. Crane," she said, "I am the youngest of Adeline Whitmore's 3 daughters. My mother left me a cabin on Bluestone Ridge. This morning I saw my older sister Harriet coming out of the office of Cyrus Thorne, and I believe she has sold or has agreed to sell property that is not hers to sell." Ambrose Crane took off his spectacles. He polished them slowly with a handkerchief. He did not look surprised. "Miss Whitmore," he said, "your mother came to this office in May, 3 months before she died. She asked me to draft certain instruments on her behalf. She also warned me that after her death, your sister Harriet would likely attempt to convey property to a buyer named Thorne, and that Harriet would do so under the belief that her authority as eldest daughter extended to all family holdings. Your mother asked me to watch for this. I've been watching." He put the spectacles back on. "A week ago," he said, "Harriet Whitmore signed a preliminary agreement of sale with Thorn Timber and Land for, quote, all extant family real property held in the Whitmore name in Leelanau County, unquote. The instrument is not yet a completed conveyance. It is a promissory agreement. Under its terms, Harriet has 90 days from the date of signing to deliver clean consolidated title to all said properties. If she delivers, Thorne pays her a sum of $800 in addition to whatever he is paying for the land itself. If she fails to deliver, Thorne retains the right to pursue her personally for breach." Merritt could not find her voice for a moment. When she did, it was quieter than she expected. "My sister signed this a week before our mother died." "Yes. Which means she knew our mother was dying. She knew Miss Whitmore, or she suspected, or she did not particularly care. I am a lawyer. I do not render judgments on motive. I tell you what the paper says. And the cabin on Bluestone Ridge, does her agreement include that?" Ambrose Crane looked at her over the rim of his spectacles. "The agreement uses the language all extant family real property. Whether that language encompasses your cabin depends on whether the cabin is properly considered family property at the time of sale. or whether it is properly considered your sole personal property already conveyed to you by deed. Your mother, it appears, foresaw this question. She drafted the deed to you in language designed to make that argument difficult for Mr. Thorne to win. Designed how? I cannot tell you the full answer today. Your mother left instructions that certain documents she deposited with me are not to be given to you until a specific condition is met. I will tell you only this. You have 90 days from the date of your sister's signing. 90 days to establish in a form that cannot be overturned that the cabin on Bluestone Ridge and the land beneath it are yours alone and have been yours alone from a date well before Harriet ever walked into Cyrus Thorne's office. Merritt stared at him. And if I cannot, then in 90 days the ridge will belong to Cyrus Thorne, and whatever is on it or under it will belong to him also. She walked out of Ambrose Crane's office into the bright September street, and she stood for a long moment at the hitching rail with her hand on her mother's deed in her pocket, and the wind coming up from the bay, and she understood finally what her mother had meant by open when the wind howls. The howling had already begun. It had only begun in a language most people could not hear. The first letter she read that night was the fourth one. Merritt sat on the warm stone floor of her mother's cellar with a tin cup of black coffee cooling beside her and Keeper the shepherd pressed against her hip, and she unfolded the page her mother had numbered 4, and she read by lantern light. In the fourth letter, Adeline Prescott Whitmore wrote about the first winter on Bluestone Ridge. She wrote about how she had been 19 years old and 6 weeks a mother, and how she had stood in that trapper's cabin with the wind coming through gaps in the wall, thick enough to put her hand through, and how she had understood with the cold clarity of a woman with an infant on her breast that she was gonna die on that ridge unless she stopped being afraid and started paying attention. She wrote about how she had learned to split wood left-handed because the right shoulder had been injured during the birth and had never healed properly. She wrote about how she had learned which of the wild plants on the ridge were food and which were medicine and which would kill a woman who mistook them in bad light. She wrote, I learned that winter what your grandmother had tried to teach me before she died, which was that a woman who pays attention can survive almost anything. I have been teaching you to pay attention since the day you were born. You have not always known you were being taught, but you were. Merritt folded the letter and laid it on the stone shelf above her mother's collection of preserved pears. Her hand when she set the letter down was steady. She had not known that about herself until that moment. She read letters 5 and 6 and 7 that same night. In the 5th, her mother wrote of meeting Merritt's father, Silas Whitmore, the quiet farmer who had come up from Ohio and who had married Adeline when Merritt was 2 years old, and who had loved the 3 daughters he helped raise without ever once making Merritt feel that she was not truly his. In the 6th, her mother wrote of Silas's death from pleurisy in the spring of 1880. In the 7th, her mother wrote that in the summer of 1881, while picking blackberries on the ridge a quarter-mile from the cabin, she had pressed her bare foot into cool moss on a hot July afternoon and had felt warm water running between her toes. And I sat down on that moss, Adeline wrote, and I began to think. And I've been thinking ever since. Merritt read those words 3 times. She climbed out of the cellar at dawn with her eyes burning and her mind very clear, and she began to work. Through the rest of September, she worked from the first gray light until the stars came out. She re-chinked every failing section of mortar in the cabin walls. Using a lime mix Alden Brennan taught her to burn from limestone she herself had quarried out of a ledge on the northern edge of her lot. She tore out every warped floor plank and replaced them with seasoned oak she bought from a mill in Cedar Run, hauling the boards 4 miles up the ridge, 2 at a time across the back of Horst Meltzer's mule. She rebuilt the floor in a way no casual visitor would recognize, with a recessed trapdoor set flush into the planking its iron ring pull sunk into a shallow oak cup, and covered when closed by a braided rag rug she hooked herself on evenings by lamplight. A man could stand on that trapdoor and not know it was there. She rehung the plank door on proper iron hinges that Alden forged for her in his barn. She cut a new window frame into the south wall and glazed it with a pane of real glass she bought for $1.75 at the hardware in town. She replaced the rusted stove with a second-hand iron cook stove Horst helped her haul up the track on a borrowed ox sled. She mortared a new chimney straight and clean, and she crowned it with a cap of hammered tin to keep the crows out. Below in the cellar, she worked by lantern. She built a second tier of shelving along the east wall. She hung iron hooks from the oak ceiling beams for drying meat and onions. She laid a second stove in the southwest corner of the cellar itself, a small box stove scarcely larger than a lunch pail, and she routed its pipe up through the cabin floor and into the chimney of the larger stove above, so that on the coldest nights of winter she could have heat rising in both chambers at once, and with the warmth of the seep already radiating out of the granite, her underground room would be warmer than any parlor in Traverse City. She worked alone most days. Alden came up twice a week with his mare and his tools and whatever he thought she might need that week, and he never asked what she was building in the cellar, and she never opened the trap door when he was in the cabin, and he understood and she understood that he understood. On the evenings he stayed for supper, she cooked salt pork and beans on the new stove, and they ate in silence mostly, and once he said, looking into the fire, "Your mother would have been pleased with this roof." She would, Merritt said. That was all either of them said for a long time. In the evenings, when Alden had gone home down the ridge, and Keeper lay at her feet chewing a knot of deer hide, Merritt read her mother's letters. She read them in order, as Adeline had instructed, one or two a night, and she made herself stop even when she wanted to read ahead because she trusted now that her mother had known exactly what she was doing when she numbered them. In the 12th letter, Adeline wrote about the geothermal seep itself. She wrote about how she had dug down the first summer with a shovel and a mattock alone at night working by moonlight so that no neighbor riding the track would see her, because she had understood from the first that what she was uncovering was the kind of thing that men would take from her if they learned of it. She wrote about how she had hauled each stone for the walls on her own back. She wrote about how the seep's water tested by her tongue was not mineral bitter in the way most warm springs were, which meant it was not a chemical spring, but simply a place where the old deep heat of the earth rose close enough to the surface to warm the rock. She wrote, "I do not know the name of the science that explains it. I know only that it is there and that it is mine, and that I have decided after thinking about it carefully for 2 years that it will one day be yours." In the 17th letter, Adeline wrote about Cyrus Thorne. She wrote only that there was a man in Detroit who had once done her a wrong, that he had grown rich in the years since, that he had moved his operations north to Traverse City in 1879. And that although Adeline had done everything she could to make sure their paths would never cross, she had seen him once from across Front Street in the summer of 1884. "He didn't see me," Adeline wrote. "He was getting out of a carriage with his wife. She is a small blonde woman. She looked happy. I hope she is. I hope she remains so. The man I once knew is not a man I would wish upon any happy woman." I turned my face away and I walked down the alley behind the church, and I went home and I began to plan more carefully than I had been planning before. Merritt read that letter on the 22nd of September with her back against the warm stone wall. And when she finished, she laid the letter down and she said aloud to the empty cellar, "Mama, what did he do to you?" She was not ready yet to know. She kept reading. The first sign that her own troubles were about to accelerate came on the 1st of October when she rode down to Alden Brennan's place at midday and found him in his yard with a bucket in one hand and murder in his face. "Alden," Somebody poisoned my well, Merritt. She stared at him. Last night, he said. I drew water this morning and it smelled wrong. I gave a little to the barn cat. The cat is alive, which is a mercy, but she is not well. Smells like coal oil. There is a film on the top of the bucket. Who? Merritt said. Alden looked at her and did not answer. They both knew. I have a second well, Alden said. Down the slope by the creek. It is shallow, but it is clean. I will use it through the winter. But I wanted you to know, Merritt, because I do not think this was meant as a warning to me. I think this was meant as a warning to you. She rode back up the ridge with her jaw set and her hands tight on the reins. That afternoon, when she went into town for the week's provisions, Horst Meltzer met her at the door of the general store with his broad face gone gray. He would not meet her eyes. Merritt, he said, I'm sorry. What is it, Horst? A gentleman came to see me yesterday. He said if I continued to employ you, my lease on this building would not be renewed in the spring. He said he had bought the building in August from Old Yarrow. I checked with the county clerk. He did. He owns my store now, Merritt. He owns the roof over my family. I'm an old man. I cannot fight him. I cannot. Thorn. Merritt stood on the worn plank floor of the store where she had swept and stocked and smiled at customers for 6 years, and she looked at Horst Meltzer, whom her mother had liked, and she put her hand on his sleeve. It's all right, Horst. It is not all right. It is. I understand. Give me this week's wages and we are square. I do not want you to lose your store. Horst Meltzer wept. Then a big man weeping without sound, and he gave her the wages and $3 extra that he pressed into her palm and would not take back, and he gave her a 10-pound sack of cornmeal and a tin of coffee and a wheel of yellow cheese for which he refused to mark the ledger. And he told her that his wife would send bread up the ridge with his oldest boy every Saturday through the winter, and no argument. She thanked him. She didn't cry until she was on the track back up. That night in the cellar, she opened the oak box. She had carried the box up and down the ladder a dozen times across those weeks, and each time she had looked at her mother's words burned into the lid. Open when the wind howls, and each time she had laid the box back on its shelf, because she understood without being told that her mother had meant something specific by it. The wind had not howled yet, not really. But that evening, with Alden's well poisoned and her wages gone, and Cyrus Thorne's breath on her neck from 2 directions, Merritt sat down on the stone floor with Keeper beside her, and she set the oak box on her lap. And she thought of Horst Meltzer crying in his own store, and she said quietly, "That is wind enough, Mama." She worked the clasps with the point of a small iron nail. She had half expected a key somewhere in the cellar, but the clasps were not locked with a key. They were locked with patience. The mechanism was simple once she understood it. Each clasp had a hidden spring that released only when pressure was applied at the corner of the brass plate. It took her an hour to find all 4. When the last one gave, the lid rose under her hands as though it had been waiting, and the hinges sighed once, and the smell of dry oilcloth and old paper rose into the lantern light. Inside the box, wrapped in layers of waxed linen, lay a single document. It was a deed. The paper was heavy cream-colored, folded in thirds. The handwriting at the top was not her mother's. It was the crabbed, slanting copperplate of a 19th century land clerk. The date at the top of the page was the 19th of May, 1861. The seal at the bottom was the red wax seal of the Leelanau County Recorder's Office, still intact, the circular stamp unbroken after 25 years. Merritt held the lantern close and she read, "Know all men. By these presents, the deed began that I, Edith Louisa Halloran, widow of the county of Leelanau and the state of Michigan, being of sound mind and under no duress, do hereby convey, grant, and assign in fee, simple, absolute, and without reservation unto my beloved niece, Adeline Prescott Spinster of the city of Detroit in the county of Wayne, The following described parcel of land situate in the township of Bingham, being 10 acres more or less, bounded on the north by the line of Federal Survey marker number 47. Merritt lowered the lantern. She set the deed on the stone floor. She sat back against the wall. Edith Halloran had conveyed this ridge to Adeline Prescott in May of 1861. 3 months before Adeline ever set foot in Michigan, before Merritt was born, before Adeline married Silas Whitmore and took his name, before there was a Whitmore family at all. The land had never been family property. It had been Adeline's property, solely, in her maiden name, conveyed by blood from the line of Adeline's mother's sister, a woman whose name Harriet had never heard spoken at the kitchen table, and whose existence Harriet had likely never bothered to ask about. Under Michigan law, as Merritt understood it, the property Edith had given Adeline in 1861 was Adeline's separate property. It never entered the marital estate when Adeline married Silas Whitmore in 1865. It was never subject to division as a family asset. It had been from the first day and every day since Adeline's alone to dispose of as she chose. And Adeline had chosen to dispose of it by deed freely executed to her daughter Merritt in the month before her death. Harriet's promissory agreement with Cyrus Thorne was worthless as to this ridge. It had been worthless the day Harriet signed it. Harriet had promised to deliver in 90 days clean title to land that had never under any theory belonged to her or her husband or her father, or the Whitmore name at all. Merritt sat with her back against the warm granite and she laughed. She laughed with tears on her face. She laughed until Keeper sat up and looked at her with worried eyes. She laughed the way a person laughs when they have been waiting a long time to understand something, and at last the thing has made itself known, and the understanding is both exactly what was hoped for and also terrible. Her mother had foreseen every step. Her mother had known in May of 1886, when she drove Ambrose Crane to draft the cabin deed, exactly what Harriet would do after the funeral, and exactly what Cyrus Thorne would try to buy, and exactly how to make sure neither of them succeeded. Her mother had been, as Alden Brennan had said, the smartest person in any room she had ever walked into. Merritt wrapped the 1861 deed carefully in its waxed linen. She placed it back in the oak box. She closed the clasps. She climbed the ladder and she carried the box into the cabin, and she laid it on the top shelf of the pine cupboard beside the stove, because she thought foolishly that a cupboard in a locked cabin 4 miles from town was a safe place to keep something that mattered. She did not put a second copy anywhere. That was the mistake. She would remember it later as the one real mistake she made in those 90 days. She had forgotten, because she was 23 and had never been hunted before, that men like Cyrus Thorne do not respect paper. They respect only what they cannot burn. Harriet came up the track on the 8th of October. Merritt heard the wagon from a long way off. She was in the side yard with a hatchet splitting cedar for the winter kindling pile, and Keeper barked twice and stood at the edge of the clearing watching the track. And when the wagon came out of the trees, it was not Thorne's black buckboard. It was Harriet's pony trap, with Harriet alone on the seat, and Harriet's face, when Merritt saw it, was the face of a woman who had been crying in private for days. Harriet climbed down. She did not come forward. She stood beside the trap with one hand on the harness, and she looked at the cabin and the new roof, and the tight mortar and the glass window and the stacked cords of firewood and the plume of clean smoke rising from the rebuilt chimney. And she took all of that in without speaking, and Merritt set down the hatchet and wiped her palms on her skirt and waited. "You've done well," Harriet said finally. "I did not expect you to do so well. I had help. From Brennan. From Mother." Harriet's face shifted. Something inside it broke. "May I come in?" "Come in." Inside at the plank table, Merritt poured coffee from the stove kettle into 2 tin cups and Harriet sat with her gloves in her lap and her eyes on the table, and for a long time she didn't speak. When she did speak, she spoke without lifting her eyes. "I signed a paper in July," she said, "in Cyrus Thorne's office. I signed a paper agreeing to deliver to him all of the family property. He offered me $800 above the purchase price to make it all one transaction. I did not know Mother was going to die so soon. I thought I had a year, maybe two, to negotiate quietly and then to put it all in motion after. I did not know." She lifted her face. Her eyes were not proud now. They were simply afraid. "I thought I was being clever." "You thought you were being clever?" "I thought Mother would leave everything to me anyway. I'm the eldest. It was always understood." "It was understood by you, Harriet?" "Yes." Harriet's voice was very quiet. "Yes, by me." Merritt said nothing. "There is something else," Harriet said. "Something I must tell you, because I do not want you to find it out from him. He has been using it to push me, to make me deliver the property on his timetable, and to make me do things I did not agree to do at the time of signing." "What is it?" Harriet put her face into her hands. "When I was 22, she said from behind her hands, "I wrote letters to a man, a married man, a banker in Manistee. The affair lasted 8 months. It ended badly. He kept the letters. When he died 4 years ago, his widow sold the contents of his desk at auction, and Cyrus Thorne purchased a certain packet of correspondence, and he has kept it in his office ever since. He showed me the letters in July. He did not show me to shame me. He showed me to explain very politely that if I did not sign the agreement with him, the letters would find their way to my husband's family in Cleveland, and my daughters' reputations would be ruined before they were old enough to understand why." Merritt sat very still. "I signed the paper, Merritt. I signed it the same afternoon he showed me the letters." "Harriet, I'm not asking for your forgiveness. I do not expect it. I'm telling you because I've been a coward and a fool, and I have put your inheritance in danger, and I am here to tell you that I will testify if I have to in any courtroom in the state that I signed that agreement under duress. I will lose everything. My daughters will know things about their mother that I would rather die than have them know. But I will do it, because I have been sitting in that frame house in town for 2 months, watching you build a life up here with nothing but your 2 hands. And I've been thinking about Mother, and I've been thinking about what she would have said to me, and I cannot look at myself in a mirror any longer." Merritt looked at her sister for a long time across the plank table. "Does Cordelia know?" "Cordelia knows." "What does Cordelia say?" "Cordelia says she is with you. She says she has been with you since August, and she was too afraid of me to say it." Merritt stood up. She walked to the cook stove and she refilled her cup, and she stood with her back to Harriet for a long moment because she did not want her sister to see her face, not yet. "Harriet, yes, the agreement you signed is worthless." Harriet did not move. "What? The land on this ridge was never family property. It was Mother's alone from a deed executed in 1861 in her maiden name from her aunt. Mother left me that deed in writing. I have it. Ambrose Crane has verified it. Your agreement with Thorne cannot convey what was never anyone's but Mother's, and now is mine." Harriet lifted her head. Her eyes filled. "And the farm," she said, "and the townhouse are Cordelia's and yours. Mother left those honestly in her will to you both. Those are yours to keep or to give to Cordelia, or to sell to Thorne for whatever he will pay you for them. Those are not my fight. My fight is the ridge, and Thorne cannot have the ridge." Harriet began to cry, quietly the way she had not cried in front of Merritt in 20 years. "The letters," she said. "The letters are your burden. I will not carry them for you. I will help you, Harriet, but I will not carry them. That is fair, but Cordelia will help you. And Alden Brennan is a man who knows how to keep a confidence. And Ambrose Crane is a lawyer who can make a man in Manisty's widow find that her late husband's letters have a way of disappearing when the right pressure is applied. You are not without friends, Harriet. You only thought you were. Harriet laid her head down on the table and she wept. And Merritt sat down beside her, and after a long while, Merritt put her hand tentatively on her eldest sister's shoulder, and Harriet turned her face into Merritt's sleeve and did not lift it for a long time. Cordelia came up the next morning with a basket of eggs and a jar of peach preserves, and her 2 small children wrapped in wool, and she stepped down from the cart, and she walked straight to Merritt in the yard, and she put her arms around her sister without a word, and Merritt, who had not been held by a sister in, she could not remember how long, stood in the cold autumn sun with Cordelia's cheek against her hair, and she closed her eyes. That night, she read letter 47. She'd been reading them 2 at a time for weeks, and she was near the end of the stack. She had read by that night the story of her mother's decision to name her Merritt. She had read the account of her mother's first winter alone. She had read the quiet chronicle of a woman learning how to survive a land that had been designed by geography and by men to break her. She had read letters about Horst Meltzer, letters about Alden Brennan, letters about Ambrose Crane, letters about the old midwife in town who had delivered Cordelia and who had died the summer before. She had read in every letter her mother's voice speaking to her with a clarity and a warmth that Adeline in life had never quite allowed herself to show. Letter 47 was dated the 15th of July, 1886. It was 3 weeks before Adeline died. Merritt unfolded it by lantern light. The handwriting was thinner than the earlier letters. Her mother's hand had been shaking when she wrote it. My quiet daughter. The letter began. I have been putting off this letter for 5 years, and I cannot put it off any longer because I feel the weight in my chest growing, and I do not believe I will see another Christmas. There is one thing I have not told you, and it is the one thing that matters most, and it is the one thing that will be most dangerous for you to know. I will tell you now because I trust you to do with the knowledge what I would have done, which is to use it not to be destroyed by it. The young man in Detroit who I wrote to you about in my 2nd and 3rd letters. The young man who told me he would marry me and who gave me a bank draft and a farewell at 18 years old, that young man did not stay poor. He married the daughter of a timber family from Saginaw. He joined her father's firm. He prospered. In the years after I came north, he expanded his father-in-law's holdings throughout the state. By the time of the war, he was a wealthy man. By the time you were 12, he was a rich one. And in 1879, when the timber began to run out in Saginaw County, he moved his principal operations to Traverse City, to our county. His name, Merritt, is Cyrus Thorne. Merritt's hand went flat on the stone floor to steady herself. He is your father by blood. He is not your father in any other respect. He never held you. He never knew your birthday. He has not known in all these years whether he fathered a son or a daughter, or whether that child lived or died. I do not know whether he has ever wondered. I know only what I have seen of him in this county, which is that he is a man who acquires things, and who acquires them whether or not they are willingly given. When I saw him across Front Street in the summer of '84, I understood, standing there in the alley, that he would one day find out about you. Not because he had been looking, because a man who buys land from widows in Leelanau County and who rides the township roads would one day notice that a woman named Whitmore had land on a ridge, and would one day ask idly at a dinner party whether she was related to the Prescott family from Detroit, and someone at that dinner would say yes, and that would be enough. That was enough to begin building this cellar. That was enough to begin hiding what I was hiding. He will try to take the ridge. He will try because he must once he realizes what is on it. A man like Cyrus does not tolerate the existence of evidence that he would prefer not to exist. And you, my daughter, are the evidence. You are the daughter he abandoned. You are the child whose existence, if it came out, would not ruin him financially, but would ruin him in his own small private account of himself, because he has spent 30 years building a man in his own mind who never did the thing he did to me. He will not let you alone once he knows. I'm sorry for this. I'm sorrier than I can say. You must survive him, Merritt. Survive him legally with the deed I have left you, which Ambrose has registered in triplicate in 3 separate county offices so that no fire will destroy the record. Survive him practically with the cellar I have built, and survive him if you can without becoming him. That is the hardest part. That is the part I have the least right to ask. But I ask it anyway because I've watched you for 23 years, and I believe you can do it, and I do not believe there is another person in this family who could. I love you. I have loved you since the night in the trapper's cabin when I named you. I'm sorry I never found a way to say it aloud that was adequate to what I meant. I am saying it now. Your mother. Merritt sat in the cellar with that letter in her lap, and she did not cry. She was past crying. She sat with her back against the warm stone, and she looked up at the oak beams of the ceiling. Her mother had worked into place alone, and she thought very quietly, I know you now. I finally know you, Mama. She folded the letter. She placed it on the shelf with the others. She went upstairs. She banked the stove. She slept deeply and without dreams for the first time in weeks. She rode into town 2 days later. She did not go to the general store. She did not go to Ambrose Crane's office. She rode directly down Front Street to the brick building with the brass plate, and she tied Horst's mule at the hitching post beside the black buckboard with the red-spoked wheels, and she walked up the 3 wooden steps and through the door without knocking. Cyrus Thorne was at his desk. He was writing a letter. He looked up when the door opened, and when he saw her, his face did something complicated that lasted less than a second, and then it composed itself into the same warm, empty smile he had brought up the ridge in August. Miss Whitmore. Mr. Thorne. To what do I owe the pleasure? I will not take your chair, Mr. Thorne. I will not take any hospitality from you. I have come to tell you 3 things, and then I will leave. Please. 1. I have read my mother's letters, all of them. I know who you are. I know what you did to her in 1861. I know what you've been trying to do to me in 1886. You have no claim on me of any kind. I refuse it in advance, and I refuse it forever. Cyrus Thorne's smile did not change. His knuckles whitened on the pen in his hand. 2. The agreement you secured from my sister is worthless as to the ridge. The ridge is not and never was family property. It has been my mother's separate property since May of 1861, recorded in triplicate, and it is now mine. I am prepared to defend that in any court in this state or any state you wish to pursue it in. My attorney is Ambrose Crane, whom I believe you have met. Ambrose Crane. Yes. Cyrus Thorne set the pen down. 3. If you or any man in your employ approaches my sister Harriet again in regard to the correspondence you have been using to coerce her, I will take the contents of my mother's letters, which include detailed accounts of an evening in Detroit in March of 1861, that I believe you would prefer not to see printed in the Grand Traverse Herald, and I will walk those letters directly to Augustus Rumsey, whom I believe is the editor, and whom I believe dislikes you a great deal. Am I clear? Cyrus Thorne stood up slowly. He was a large man, and he had been handsome once. She could see it in the bones of his face. She could see also the shape of her own jawline in his, and the fact of it turned her stomach. You are clever, he said in a voice that was no longer warm. I come by it honestly. Your mother was clever too. In the end, it did not save her. My mother is past your reach, Mr. Thorne. I am not, but I will be. She walked to the door. She put her hand on the knob. She turned. One last thing. I am not afraid of you. She was lying. She was extremely afraid of him. But she had learned that that being afraid and acting afraid were two different things, and that the second was a choice. She walked out into the October sun, and she untied the mule, and she rode home up the ridge, and she did not look back. She should have. The weather broke on the 27th of November. Not a storm yet. A cold snap. The thermometer on the south wall of the cabin read 6 degrees above zero at sunrise, and the wind had a knife in it, and Alden Brennan, who had come up the track that morning to help her move the last of the smoked meat from the drying shed into the cellar, stood in the yard looking northwest across the trees toward Lake Michigan, and he said quietly, "It is coming tonight, Merritt, or tomorrow. The sky has that color. How bad?" "Bad. The geese went 2 weeks early this year. My knee has been aching since Sunday. I would say we have 18 hours, maybe less." They worked through the morning, cords of wood and under the eave. The last of the water hauled in and set in the cellar where it would not freeze. Keeper's feed moved to the cellar shelf. The axes, the saw, the kerosene, the spare lantern chimneys all brought down the ladder. By noon, the cabin above was stripped of anything that could not be easily replaced, and the cellar below was a snug and living room with 9 months of food and fuel stacked against its walls. At 1 o'clock, they heard the horses, 3 of them, coming up the track at a trot, fast. Merritt went to the window. The rider in front was a heavy man in a long black coat and a flat-brimmed hat with a 5-pointed star of hammered tin pinned to his coat. Sheriff Hollis Mercer out of Traverse City, a man who had been elected to the post 4 years earlier on the strength of Cyrus Thorne's considerable contributions to his campaign, and who had in the years since been seen more often in Thorne's office than in his own. Behind him rode 2 men Merritt did not recognize in rough coats with rifles slung across their backs. She turned to Alden. "Down," she said. "Now, take Keeper. Take the box with the deed on the top shelf of the cupboard. Merritt, Alden down, please. I will handle this." He went. He took the box and Keeper, and he went down the ladder, and she closed the trap door behind him, and she pulled the braided rug over the ring pull, and she stood up and smoothed her skirt, and she opened the cabin door at the first knock. Sheriff Mercer was on the top step. He didn't take off his hat. "Merritt Whitmore." "Sheriff, I have here a warrant to search these premises for stolen property. Signed this morning by Judge Merrifield. Property in question is a quantity of survey equipment stolen from Thorne Timber and Land on the night of the 24th. You are to stand aside and allow me and my deputies to search the structure." "That warrant is a fiction, Sheriff. The warrant is signed, ma'am. Judge Merrifield is Cyrus Thorne's wife's second cousin. The warrant is a fiction." Mercer's mouth tightened. "Stand aside, Miss Whitmore, or I'll move you aside." She stood aside. They did not search for survey equipment. They did not even pretend to. The first deputy went directly to the pine cupboard beside the stove, and he pulled open the top cabinet, and he swept the shelves bare with one arm, shattering a stack of tin plates on the floor. The second deputy went to the bedroom corner where her trunk sat, and he tipped the trunk on its side and dumped its contents across the floor. Mercer himself went to the plank table where Merritt had the night before been reading the last of her mother's letters, and he gathered the loose papers in 2 hands, and he crumpled them, and he shoved them into the open door of the cook stove, and then he kicked the stove door shut. "The warrant says burn any illegal documents found on the premises," he said without looking at her. "I am executing the warrant. You are destroying my mother's correspondence. I am executing the warrant, Miss Whitmore." The second deputy struck a match at the woodpile outside the door, and he threw the match onto a bundle of pitch kindling he had stacked against the south wall of the cabin. The pitch went up in a sheet of orange flame. Inside, Mercer opened the firebox of the cook stove and raked 3 scoops of live coals out onto the new oak floorboards, and he backed out of the doorway, and the draft from the broken window lifted the flames, and within 90 seconds, the inside of the cabin was burning. "Come out, Miss Whitmore. You have burned my house, Sheriff. Come out or burn in it." She came out. She stood in the yard with her hands at her sides as Hollis Mercer and his 2 deputies mounted their horses and turned them, and rode back down the track at a slow walk, because they wanted her to see them leaving, and they wanted her to understand that nothing would be done about it, and that the sheriff of Leelanau County had just burned a woman's home in broad daylight on a warrant signed by a judge who owed Cyrus Thorne his seat, and that this was the world. The cabin burned. It burned for 40 minutes. The oak floor burned. The cedar shingles she had split with her own hands burned. The plank table where she had read her mother's letters burned. The cupboard where she had kept the 1861 deed burned because she had left the lid of the oak box open when she took the papers out that morning to cross-check a clause, and the waxed linen wrapping had caught, and the deed had gone up her only copy, her mother's 25-year safeguard, in less than a minute. The stone walls did not burn. Adeline had built them too well. The stone walls stood black-streaked and smoke-stained as the flames died and the roof fell in and the timbers settled and the yard filled with the smell of wet char, and the first flakes of the blizzard her mother had felt coming in her bones began to fall. Merritt stood in the snow that fell faster and faster through the dying smoke, and she looked at the ruin of the house her mother had built and her own hands had rebuilt, and she did not scream, and she did not weep. She walked across the yard. She knelt beside the blackened door sill. She found with numb fingers the place where the stone foundation met the earth. She brushed aside the snow and the hot ash. She felt for the iron ring. The trapdoor was warm to the touch. It was not burned. Her mother had set it in stone. She lifted the ring and she opened the trapdoor, and warm yellow lantern light rose into her face out of the earth. And Alden Brennan's worried eyes looked up at her from the ladder, and Keeper whined once, a high, anxious whine from behind him. "Come down, Merritt. I'm coming." She looked north once across the trees toward the dark wall of cloud that was coming off Lake Michigan faster than any horse could ride. Then she climbed down into her mother's cellar, and she pulled the trapdoor closed above her head, and she slid the iron bolt across the underside. And she stood in the warm amber light on the fitted stone floor that her mother had laid one stone at a time across 5 years of secret Saturdays. And the wind began at last to howl. The blizzard that came down off Lake Michigan on the night of the 27th of November 1886 would be remembered in Leelanau County for 50 years. It came in 3 waves, each worse than the one before. And between the waves the wind did not fall, but only gathered itself. And on the rare hour when a man could see past the end of his own outstretched hand, he saw a world that had been erased and redrawn in a single pale color, with the shapes of fences and outbuildings barely suggested beneath 10 feet of packed drift. Merritt Whitmore did not see any of that for 3 days. She sat on the stone floor of her mother's cellar with her back against the wall that held the geothermal seep, and she felt the warmth of the old, deep earth against her shoulder blades, and she listened to the storm tear at the world above her head. Alden Brennan was across from her on the rope-frame bed, wrapped in a sheepskin keeper pressed against his knee. Neither of them spoke for a long time. The small box stove in the southwest corner held a low bed of coals. The main stove upstairs had gone with the cabin, but the little one below was enough. The thermometer on the north wall of the cellar held at 70 degrees, while the world above dropped to 20 below, and the air smelled faintly of cedar smoke and dried apples, and the particular dry stone smell of Michigan bedrock that has been warmed for 5 years by a trickle of water older than the country that claimed it. On the second night of the storm, Merritt spoke. "They burned the deed, Alden. I know. It was the only copy in my possession. I know that too. Ambrose said he had registered it in triplicate. He said that to my mother. But I do not know if that was true or only a reassurance he gave to a dying woman who needed to hear it. Alden looked at her over the shepherd's head. His pale blue eyes were very steady. Ambrose Crane, he said, has been a lawyer in this county for 22 years, and the only thing he is worse at than lying is pretending that he lied. If he said it was registered in triplicate Merritt, then it was registered in triplicate. The question is only whether the 3 offices he chose are all still standing after this week. She nodded. She drew her knees up. She laid her chin on them. Alden, yes, I am 23 years old and I have never in my life struck a man, and tonight I think I would like to kill one. Alden was quiet for a moment. That is a feeling, he said, and a feeling is not a plan. It passes. You wait for it to pass. Then you do what your mother would have done, which is not to kill him, but to outlast him. Your mother understood that the worst thing you could do to a man like Cyrus Thorne was to still be standing when he was not. Merritt closed her eyes. She let her head rest back against the warm stone. How long does a storm like this last? 3 days, maybe 4, then a breath, then another one behind it, usually worse, and people will die. People are dying right now, Merritt, all over the peninsula. The ones who did not stack enough wood, the ones whose roofs were bad, the ones who thought the geese were lying when they went south in October. Tonight, the county is paying the price for 100 small cheapnesses it spent the summer choosing. There is nothing you or I can do about it from this cellar, so we will not try. We will keep our fire low, we will eat what we have, we will sleep when sleep comes, and we will wait. She nodded. She slept at last sometime before dawn with Keeper at her feet. The first knock on the trapdoor came on the afternoon of the 3rd day. The storm had fallen briefly into one of its hollow silences. The wind above had dropped from a scream to a long, sighing moan, and Merritt was heating coffee at the box stove when 3 soft thuds sounded through the oak planking of the ceiling, followed by a woman's voice cracked almost to nothing, calling a name. Merritt, Merritt, please. Merritt was up the ladder before Alden could set down his cup. She pushed the trapdoor up through 6 inches of sifted snow that had blown in through what was left of the cabin walls. The stone foundation still stood blackened and roofless, but the walls had broken the wind enough that the space inside the burned shell was only half filled with drift rather than entirely. 100 feet away at the edge of the clearing, a small bundled group stood against the gray wall of the forest. Harriet was in front. Her face was the color of old paper. Behind her, Cordelia held the 2 small children against her chest, one to each shoulder. The 5-year-old girl, Ruth, had her face buried in Cordelia's collar. The 3-year-old boy, Tobias, was too cold to cry, which was the worst sign of all. Merritt came up out of the trapdoor and waved them forward through the ruin. Come, quickly. Harriet staggered the last 20 feet. When she reached Merritt, she did not embrace her. She gripped her sleeve with both hands like a drowning woman grips a rope. The chimney cracked 2 nights ago. We've been burning chairs. The pipes burst yesterday. There is no water. Tobias would not wake this morning until we rubbed snow on his cheeks. Merritt, I thought he was dead. I thought I had killed my own child because I was too proud to come to you sooner. Down the ladder, Harriet. Go. Cordelia, hand Tobias down to me. She took the little boy into her arms. He was too light. She passed him to Alden at the foot of the ladder, and Alden laid him on the sheepskin by the stove and began to work his small blue fingers between his own large warm palms without a word. Cordelia came down with Ruth. Harriet came last. And in the amber lantern light of the cellar her mother had built, Harriet Whitmore turned in a slow circle. She looked at the shelves lined with over 100 jars of preserved food. She looked at the barrels of grain along the east wall. She looked at the dried herbs hanging in bundles from the oak ceiling beams, at the sheepskins folded on the stone shelf at the small stove glowing with its bed of coals, at the trickle of warm water seeping from the granite in the southeast corner and pooling in its ancient basin. And Harriet Whitmore, who had read the will that August afternoon with the practiced pity of a woman handing a worthless thing to a younger sister, put her face in her hands and she wept, not the performative tears, the other kind. "I did not know her," she said into her hands. "I lived in her house for 31 years and I did not know her. I did not know her at all." Merritt did not answer. She knelt by the stove and pulled a woolen blanket over Tobias. She did not need to answer. The cellar answered for her. The second knock came that night. A man's voice ragged, calling through the trap door. Silas Pell, the trapper, whom Alden recognized by the timbre of the voice before he even got up the ladder. Silas had followed the smoke of the little stovepipe through 2.5 miles of drift, and by the time he reached the cellar, 2 of his fingers on his right hand were frozen so hard the flesh clicked like wood when Alden examined it. Alden spent an hour working those fingers in snow, and then in cool water, and then in warm, and Silas did not lose them, though he would never again play the fiddle he had been carrying inside his coat. The third knock came the next morning. Widow Ashcombe and her son, a boy of 14 named Peter, whose own roof had collapsed under the weight of snow 2 nights earlier, and who had dug themselves out of the wreckage and walked because there was no other choice, the 3 miles to the only smoke still rising on the ridge. By the evening of the 4th day, Merritt Whitmore's cellar held 9 souls: herself, Alden, Harriet, Cordelia, Ruth, Tobias, Silas, Widow Ashcombe, Peter, and Keeper. It was cramped. There was not room for all of them to lie down at once, and so they slept in shifts, and Merritt rationed the food by weight and the lamp oil by the hour, and she did not raise her voice. She did not raise her voice because her mother had never raised hers. On the 6th day, when the second wave of the blizzard came screaming in off the lake, it was the worst of the 3. They heard the storm come down like a train. The wind went from a moan to a roar inside the space of a quarter hour. Above them, in the roofless stone shell of the burned cabin, the drifts began to pile so deeply that by the middle of the night, Merritt could no longer hear the wind at all, because the snow itself had become the roof, and they were buried, and the only sound left was the occasional sigh of the earth settling around her mother's stonework. Harriet, in the dark, found Merritt's hand on the bench by the stove. "If we die down here," Harriet said very quietly so the children would not hear, "I want you to know that I understand now. We are not going to die down here, Harriet. I want you to know anyway. All right. I was not a good sister to you, Merritt. I know. I'm sorry. I know." Harriet held her hand for a long time in the warm dark, and after a while she slept with her head on Merritt's shoulder, the way she had not slept against her youngest sister since they were both small girls before their father died, before their mother grew quiet, before the world had arranged itself into the shape in which everyone except Adeline believed that Harriet was the important one. The knock that mattered came on the 8th day in the deepest hour of the second wave. It was not a knock. It was a sound almost too weak to be a sound. A slow, irregular tapping barely transmitted through the 4 feet of packed snow and the foot of oak planking and the stone sill. Keeper lifted his head and growled a low, unsettled growl she had not heard him make before, and she sat up on the bench in the dim cellar where 8 sleeping bodies breathed in the lantern half-light, and she listened. Tap, 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 a pause, tap. Alden was awake. He met her eyes across the glow of the stove. He shook his head once. "No one should be out in that, Merritt." "No one should be. Someone is. Merritt, I know. I know who it is. I have known since I heard the first tap." She rose. She drew her coat around her. She climbed the ladder. It took her 10 minutes to open the trapdoor because the snow above it had packed so dense that she had to shovel up into it and let it fall around her on the ladder. And she was soaked to the waist and coated in powder by the time she forced the hatch wide. She pulled herself up into the burned-out shell of the cabin, and she saw by the pale blue light of a storm moon that was somewhere above the clouds a figure collapsed against the broken doorsill, with one gloved hand still raised. The wool coat was ice. The hat was gone. The face, when she knelt over it, was the face she had confronted in a Traverse City office 6 weeks before, and now it was the color of wet ash, and the lips were the color of plums crushed on frozen ground. Cyrus Thorne looked up at her with eyes that no longer had any arrangement left in them. The expensive carriage that had brought him out of town lay a mile back down the ridge on its side in a drift with a broken axle and a dead horse. The other horse and Sheriff Hollis Mercer had gone on without him 3 hours earlier because Hollis Mercer had weighed the merits of staying with an injured man in a blizzard against the merits of saving his own skin and had chosen. Thorne had walked the rest of the way with one boot missing and his hands gone past feeling, and he had walked because the only chimney he could see smoke from within a 10-mile radius was Merritt Whitmore's, and he had understood with the strange cold clarity of a man at the end of his strength that either his daughter would kill him or she would not, and either way, it was warmer than where he was. He tried to say something. His tongue was too thick. The sound that came out was not a word. For one heartbeat, Merritt Whitmore stood over the man who had taken everything from her mother at the beginning of her mother's life and had tried to take everything from her daughter at the end of it. And she thought with the coldness of the stone beneath her knees, I could close the trapdoor and walk back down. I could leave him here. In an hour he will be gone. In 6 hours he will be buried. In the spring, someone will find a coat with a gold watch chain in it. Nobody will ever know. Nobody will ever ask. She thought it clearly. She thought it all the way through. And then she thought of her mother, not of the wronged 18-year-old girl in Detroit, not of the young woman alone on the ridge with an infant, but of the woman who had in the winter of 1872 walked 4 miles through knee-deep snow to sit for 9 days with a grieving neighbor she barely knew. Her mother had not asked whether that neighbor deserved it. Merritt caught Cyrus Thorne under the arms. Alden. The old man's head appeared at the trap door. "God help us," Alden Brennan said very softly when he saw who it was. "Help me get him down." Merritt, Alden. They got him down the ladder together. It was not easy. He was a large man and a deadweight, and by the time they had him on the stone floor of the cellar, Cordelia was awake, and the lantern had been lit full, and Harriet stood against the wall with one hand at her throat and one hand on Ruth's shoulder, holding the child back from the scene. "Merritt," Harriet whispered. "That is." "I know who it is, Harriet. What are you going to?" "I'm going to thaw his hands so they do not have to be cut off. And then I'm going to feed him broth if he can swallow it. And then I am going to decide what I'm going to do next, but I am not going to decide it tonight." Harriet stared at her. "That is not what I would do," Harriet said quietly. "I know, Harriet. That is why Mother did not leave this cellar to you." It took 4 hours to bring Cyrus Thorne far enough back from the edge of death that they could be reasonably certain he would live until morning. Alden worked his hands with patient rhythmic massage, first in cold water, then in cool, then in tepid, then in gently warm, the way he had worked Silas Pell's fingers 2 days before. Merritt cut the ruined boot off the foot that had frozen inside it, and she thawed that foot the same way. She dripped broth into his mouth with a spoon. She watched the color come back into his lips by slow, terrible increments. He was conscious around 2 in the morning, his eyes focused on the oak beams overhead, then on the lantern, then on the shelves of preserved food, then on the faces ringed around him unmoving in the lamplight. Alden, Harriet, Cordelia, and then on Merritt's face directly above his own. His mouth moved. The word that came out was barely a word. Adeline. No, Mr. Thorne. His eyes filled, his whole face broke apart. I'm sorry. I know. I'm so sorry. You may stop, Mr. Thorne. You may rest. You may think about what you want to say in the morning when you have strength to say it, and when I have strength to hear it. You are alive. You are warm. You are as safe in this room as any man in this county is tonight. That is what I can give you. That is what my mother would have given you. Nothing more, nothing less. Sleep. He slept. She did not. Slept. She did. She sat on the stone bench beside the sleeping body of the man who was her father by blood and her enemy by every other measure, and she watched his chest rise and fall, and she thought without satisfaction, this is how it ends. With the stupidest man in the county on my floor, with all of his power reduced to whether a 23-year-old girl remembers to refill the lamp before dawn, she did not feel triumph. She felt only a long, exhausted tenderness toward her mother for all the things her mother had chosen to do and all the things she had chosen not to do, and how each of those choices had built the stone room Merritt was now sitting in. Cyrus Thorne was strong enough to sit up the next afternoon and strong enough to speak in full sentences the morning after that, and strong enough to weep, which he did at length when Merritt brought him a tin cup of broth and sat down across from him on the stone bench and said, "Now we will talk." He did not protest. He nodded. He drank the broth. His hands shook so badly he needed both of them on the cup. She laid on the stone between them the 3 items she had taken out of the hidden recess under the rope-frame bed at first light that morning. The first item was a second deed, cream paper, heavy. The identical deed from Edith Halloran to Adeline Prescott, dated the 19th of May, 1861. The difference was in the stamp at the bottom. This copy had been registered not only at the Leelanau County Recorder's Office, but also in 2 additional endorsements stamped in green ink at the Grand Traverse County Recorder's Office in Traverse City and at the Michigan State Land Office in Lansing. 3 separate governmental records, all stating that on the 19th of May, 1861, a widow named Edith Halloran had conveyed 10 acres on Bluestone Ridge in fee, simple absolute, to her niece, Adeline Prescott. 3 records in 3 buildings which no sheriff with a fake warrant could reach. Her mother had told the truth to the dying woman, because Adeline had never in her life been the dying woman who needed lies. Her mother had told the truth because the truth had, as usual, been the plan. The second item was a sealed leather envelope. Across the front in her mother's hand was written, "To the man who was once Cyrus." The third item was an unopened letter in her mother's hand addressed simply, "For my quiet daughter." This one last, letter 48. Merritt had not opened it yet. She had known when her fingers found it in the hidden recess at dawn that she was not meant to open it alone. She had known as certainly as she had known anything in the past 3 months that her mother had meant for her to open it in the presence of the man across from her. She pushed the sealed leather envelope across the stone. "This is for you, Mr. Thorne. My mother wrote it. I have not read it. I do not want to read it. Whatever is in it is between her and you. You may read it when we are done here, and you may keep it or burn it or do with it what you wish. That is not my concern." Cyrus Thorne looked at the envelope. His hands trembled toward it. He did not yet pick it up. She picked up her own letter. She broke the seal with her thumb. She unfolded it. She read it aloud. Not for him, for herself. Because she had been reading her mother's voice alone in a cellar for 3 months, and she thought on the 48th and last letter that her mother might like to be heard. "My quiet daughter Adeline" wrote in the last letter she ever wrote. It was dated the 1st of August, 1886, 3 days before her death. If you are reading this letter, then the hardest thing has come, and it has come in the shape I feared. The cabin has burned, or something very like it has. The papers I gave you have been taken. You are sitting below the ground now, in the only safe room there is, and you are deciding what sort of woman you are going to be in the morning. I'm going to tell you about a winter in 1872. I've never told you about it. I told you in letter 28 that I walked to Alden Brennan's place during that winter and stayed 9 days. That was true. It was not the whole truth. The whole truth is that I walked to Alden's place that winter because a man in our town had come to me at the laundry the week before and had said that Alden Brennan was going to drink himself to death before Christmas, and that somebody had to go sit with him, and that nobody else would. The man said this because he knew Alden had once been good to me. The man said it expecting that I would refuse because Alden was a stranger and I had 3 small children at home and I was not a nurse and it was January and there was no good reason. I did not refuse. I went, I sat, I cooked, I washed. I did not speak much because Alden did not want to hear speaking. When I left, Alden was alive and he was going to stay alive. You know the rest. I am telling you this because I want you to understand that I did not go to Alden Brennan's house in 72 because Alden deserved it. I did not know whether he deserved it. I did not know Alden. I went because I was the person who could, and there was no one else who would. And a human life had been placed within my reach. And I had decided a long time before that I was not going to be the sort of person who turned away from a human life within her reach, regardless of who the human was or what he had done or not done. I had decided that because in the winter of 1861, when I came up this ridge pregnant and unmarried and alone, an old woman I barely knew took me in, and she didn't ask whether I deserved it either. She gave me 10 acres and a death blessing and a chance at my own life. She gave it because I was within her reach. She didn't ask what I would do with it. She hoped only that I would not waste it. I did not waste it. Merit, my girl. If a man has come to you in the storm, and if that man is the one you think it is, and if he is helpless at your door, I want you to know that I'm not asking you to love him. I'm not asking you to forgive him. Love and forgiveness belong to the one who gives them, and nobody, not even a mother, is allowed to require them. What I am asking is only that you be the woman Edith Halloran was to me in 1861. That you extend the warmth in your stone to the cold at your door, because the warmth is yours to extend, and the cold is no longer your concern. That is the one thing I am asking. The second thing I am asking is smaller and also larger. I wrote a letter to the man who was once Cyrus. It is sealed. I want you to give it to him if he is there. I do not want you to read it, not because I'm ashamed of it, because it was written for him, and you do not owe any part of yourself to his reading of it. Your inheritance from me is the stone and the seep and the daughter I raised, and that is enough, and that is everything. The letter to him is not yours. Give it. Walk away. I love you. I have loved you since the night I named you. I have been the luckiest woman in the county for 23 years because I have been your mother, and because you have been exactly the daughter I hoped you would be, and because you do not yet know how strong you are, but you will because you are about to find out. The stone stays warm, my quiet daughter. So does the heart that forgives. They are not the same thing. Either one is enough. Your mother. Merit folded the letter. She laid it on the stone beside her knee. Cyrus Thorne was crying. He had picked up the sealed envelope at some point during her reading, and he was holding it in both hands as though it weighed more than he could carry. She forgave me, he whispered. No, Mr. Thorne. He looked up. She did not write that she forgave you. She wrote that I do not owe any part of myself to your reading of her letter. You may read it. You may take from it what you find in it. That is between you and her, and I have no part in it, and I do not wish one. What my mother asked of me was that I give you warmth at my door. I have given it. What happens next is a separate matter. His face crumpled. What happens next, he said. What happens next is that tomorrow when the storm gives us an hour and Alden can ride for Traverse City, you will dictate and sign in his presence and in the presence of my sisters a full statement. You will state that the warrant under which my home was destroyed was procured by fraud at your direction through Judge Merrifield, who is your wife's cousin. You will state that the agreement under which my sister Harriet signed over property that was not hers to sell was procured through coercion using private correspondence that you obtained at auction and held over her for the purpose of compelling her cooperation. You will turn over to me without condition that correspondence along with any other instruments you have used to coerce any person in this county. You will further convey to this township by deed free and clear the 9 parcels you have acquired from widows and daughters on this peninsula in the last 4 years. You will pay restitution in cash to each of those 9 families in a sum I will calculate and Ambrose Crane will verify. You will resign from your position on the board of the Grand Traverse Bank. You will leave this county by the 1st of April. You will not return. He was silent. His hands shook around the envelope. In return, Mr. Thorne, I will not publish my mother's letters. The county will know that you have made restitution. The county will not know the rest. Your wife will not know the rest. Your children, your legitimate ones, will not know the rest. You will not end your life in disgrace. You will end it in exile quietly wherever you choose to go. That is the trade. That is all of it. Do you accept? He did not answer for a long time. Your mother, he said very softly, would not have demanded this much. My mother, Merritt said, is not here to ask. I am here. I am her daughter. I am also the daughter you abandoned in 1863. You have 1 daughter still in the room. Mr. Thorne, and 1 in the ground, and the 1 in the room is the one whose terms you are going to accept because she is the only one left who can still offer you any. He bowed his head. I accept. He signed the next morning at the plank table Alden Brennan dragged down into the cellar for the purpose. He signed in the presence of Harriet Whitmore, Cordelia Whitmore, widow Ashcombe Silas Pell, and Alden Brennan, who served as the witness of record. He signed in a hand that shook so badly that Cordelia had to steady his wrist with her own warm fingers, a kindness Cyrus Thorne did not ask for and did not thank her for, and did not forget until the day he died. The document ran to 11 pages. It covered every particular Merritt had laid out the night before, and 2 that Alden Brennan added, and 3 that Cordelia remembered from her late husband's business dealings with Thorne 6 years earlier, and 1 that Harriet added because she wanted, she said quietly, to put her own name to it so that nobody in the future could say she had not. The second wave of the storm broke on the 12th of December. On the 13th, Alden Brennan rode down the ridge to Traverse City on Merritt's mule. He carried the 11-page document wrapped in oilcloth beneath his coat, and a second smaller oilcloth package containing Harriet Whitmore's Manistee letters, which Cyrus Thorne had directed him in writing to retrieve from the office safe using a key that Thorne himself had drawn from an inside pocket and given to Alden with both hands. Alden returned on the 15th. He brought with him Ambrose Crane, who had heard the news by that time and had wept briefly and dryly in his office before riding out in the cold. He brought also a notary public named Mrs. Ellsbury, a stout, unamused woman of 60, who had notarized documents for the county of Leelanau for 30 years, and who had Ambrose said a particular distaste for men who coerced widows. They spent 1 full day in the cellar. Mrs. Ellsbury notarized every page. Ambrose Crane examined the document for legal sufficiency. Thorne signed a second and third time under her stamp. Harriet surrendered her letters 1 by 1 into the fire of the box stove, and Mrs. Ellsbury watched them burn, and Mrs. Ellsbury signed a statement attesting that she had witnessed their destruction, and the statement would be filed in the county record as a permanent protection against any future claim that such letters had ever existed. When it was done, Mrs. Ellsbury looked across the warm stone chamber at Merritt Whitmore, and she said, "Your mother did this." "My mother began it. Your mother did this," Mrs. Ellsbury repeated, and that was the only thing Mrs. Ellsbury said about Adeline Whitmore, and it was enough. Cyrus Thorne died in his sleep on the 18th of December. It was not unexpected. His body had been broken by the walk through the storm, and the frostbite had gone deeper than Alden's patients had been able to reach. His kidneys had stopped properly functioning by the 15th. By the 17th, he could not keep food down. On the evening of the 17th, he asked Merritt in a voice almost too soft to hear whether he might be permitted to keep her mother's letter with him through the night. "Yes, Mr. Thorne. Thank you." He did not speak again. When Alden found him in the morning, the sealed leather envelope had been opened and its contents had been refolded and placed against his chest, and one hand was closed around them, and the face of Cyrus Thorne was for the first time since Merritt had met him the face of a man not pretending. They buried him on the 21st of December under the birch tree at the back of the clearing, in a grave that Alden and Silas Pell had to thaw with buckets of hot water from the seep before they could dig. Merritt turned the first shovelful of earth. She did not pray over him. She didn't speak. She did it because her mother had once said that hatred didn't keep anyone warm, and Merritt had decided, standing over the open ground, that she was not going to let hers keep her cold. She kept no mark on the grave. In time, the birch would do that for her. The storms did not break finally until the second week of February. Across Leelanau County in the peninsulas north of Grand Traverse Bay, the winter of 1886 and 87 was the worst in living memory. 47 people died. Hundreds lost livestock and outbuildings and the provisions they had believed would see them through. The roads did not fully clear until April. In a stone cellar beneath the ruined cabin on Bluestone Ridge, 9 people and a dog lived through the whole of it, and none of them went hungry, and none of them took sick beyond what could be nursed. And when at last the snow began to shrink from the south-facing slopes, and the birch sap began to rise, they climbed up one by one into a world that had been remade. Harriet did not go back to the frame house in town. She stayed that spring and helped Merritt frame a new cabin on the old foundation, larger this time, with 2 rooms and a proper porch and a chimney, Alden built with his own hands. Harriet learned for the first time in 31 years of her life how to split cedar. She was not good at it. She got better. Cordelia took her children back to the River Bottom farm, but she came up the ridge every Sunday through the summer with eggs and milk and a share of whatever her garden had made, and she did not speak of the cabin with anything other than reverence for the rest of her life. Her daughter Ruth, who had been 5 that winter, would one day be a school teacher in Traverse City, who ended every year by telling her 5th graders the true story of how she had lived through the storm of '86 in her aunt's warm stone room. The story would grow in the telling. Nobody who heard it from Ruth ever forgot it. Silas Pell did not play the fiddle again. He learned to play the concertina instead, which could be worked with the 3 good fingers on his right hand, and which he claimed without much conviction sounded better in a small room anyway. He built a cabin of his own a mile down the ridge from Merritt's, and through the rest of his life he never once passed Merritt's clearing without stopping to split a cord of wood in her yard, whether she was home or not. Widow Ashcombe and her son Peter stayed with Merritt through the spring. When the roads cleared, the widow married, to her own considerable astonishment, a widower farmer from Cedar Run, and moved to a small house with glass in every window, and died 11 years later in that house, surrounded by children who were not hers by blood and who grieved her as though they were. Peter Ashcombe became a master cooper in Traverse City and made his first barrel as a gift for Merritt Whitmore's cellar. Alden Brennan lived another 15 years. He died in the summer of 1901 of nothing more dramatic than old age in his sleep in his own bed with Merritt at his side. He left her his house, his mare, his tools, and a short note thanking her mother for a winter in 1872. Merritt buried him in the yard of his own place beside the wife and 2 sons he had lost long before she ever knew him, and she kept the note folded inside the oak box for the rest of her life. Harriet remarried late at 41 to a kind widower named Josiah Weld, who had known her as a girl and who asked nothing of her past. She had no more children. She adored Cordelia's 2. She and Merritt never again spoke of the summer of 1886, not because the wound was open, but because it was finally closed, and they both knew that there was no purpose in reopening closed things. When Harriet died in 1912, she was buried in Traverse City beside her second husband, and her will left every dollar of her own small savings to Merritt Whitmore with the single sentence, "She was right, and I'm sorry it took me so long." Cordelia lived to be 83. The land on Bluestone Ridge was never sold, never subdivided, never consolidated into any other holding. In the spring of 1887, when the county seat in Traverse City opened its ledgers to process the 9 deed conveyances that Cyrus Thorne had signed in the cellar, the Leelanau County Recorder's Office quietly updated every plat book that touched Merritt Whitmore's property to reflect the clean chain of title from Halloran to Prescott to Whitmore. And the title was never again challenged, not once in any court. Merritt lived in that cabin for the rest of her life. She never married. She was asked 3 times in her 20s and twice in her 30s, and once by a widower she liked very much in her 40s. Each time she said no kindly, and each time the man who asked her understood, and 2 of them remained her friends. She was not a woman who needed a second person in her stone room. She had, in some way she could never quite explain even to Cordelia, already been joined there by somebody, and that was enough. She improved the land year by year. She cleared a vegetable garden in the south-facing patch beside the spring. She built a proper barn and a smokehouse and a spring house that drew its cooling from the same seep that warmed the cellar, because the seep gave off warm air but collected cold water at the outflow. And Merritt had been her mother's daughter long enough to know that a seep was only as valuable as the number of ways a person could use it. She took in, across 40 years, a succession of women and girls who needed a warm place for a season. She did not advertise this. Word passed quietly among the midwives and the nurses of 3 counties. Young women in trouble, old women turned out by sons' widows who had no one, girls running from things the law would not help them run from, all found their way at one time or another up the logging track to Bluestone Ridge. And Merritt Whitmore opened her door, and none of them were ever asked what they had done or why. And each of them, when she left in a better condition than she had come. The geothermal seep never faltered. It had been there, Merritt understood, by the time she was 40 for thousands of years before her mother had dug down to it. It would be there for thousands after. She died in the autumn of 1938. She was 75. Her hair was white and her hands were strong to the end, and she died in the cabin. Her hands had rebuilt twice and expanded 4 times in the bed. Her mother's seep warmed through the floorboards, even in November, with a niece on each side of the bed and an old shepherd dog 2 generations descended from the first keeper on the rag rug at her feet. The last thing she said to Ruth Whitmore Halloran, who had come from Traverse City to sit with her, was her mother's phrase, "The stone stays warm." Ruth kissed her aunt's forehead. Ruth did not cry until she was outside in the yard alone, looking up at the unchanged ridge in the low red light of an October sun. The cabin on Bluestone Ridge is still there. It stood through the great storms of 1896 and 1905 and 1978, and it stands yet 3 rooms now, with a tin roof and new glass in the windows, and a cement patch in the chimney, occupied as a summer place by a descendant of Cordelia's, who knows most, though not all, of the story. The stone walls are the same stone walls Adeline Prescott laid in the summer of 1881. The cellar beneath the floor is the same cellar. The seep still runs warm to the touch winter and summer at a temperature that has been measured by a curious university student and found to be 58 degrees unchanged from the first day Adeline put her hand to it and understood what she had found. On the back wall of the cellar behind the lowest shelf in the stone her mother laid with her own hands, there is a small chipped X where Merritt Whitmore long ago pried away a loose stone and found her mother's letters. The letters themselves are not there anymore. They are in a climate-controlled archive at a small historical society in Traverse City, donated by Ruth Whitmore Halloran in 1951, where they may be read on request by any member of the public with a serious interest. And they are read sometimes by historians and sometimes by young women who have heard the story a long way from where it happened and who want to see the handwriting. They are read also once a year on the 1st of August by the current descendant of Cordelia, who carries them up the ridge on that day and reads them aloud in order from 1 to 48. In the warm amber light of the cellar, her great-great-aunt, Adeline Prescott Whitmore, built with her own 2 hands for a daughter whose quietness she understood to be strength in a year that did not yet know it was going to need what she was making. The stone stays warm. So does the heart that forgives. Either one is enough.